Canada is not a place people often think of when domestic terrorism is mentioned. However, it has had its fair share of conflict, especially in Quebec during the 1960s. This period of violence culminated in the October Crisis of 1970, which in many ways still has a profound influence on politics in Quebec and Canada as a whole to this day. But how did it happen? On September 13, 1759, British troops defeated the inexperienced French defenders of Quebec City and their indigenous allies on the Plains of Abraham, just outside the walls of the city itself. James Wolfe, the British general, and his French counterpart the Marquis de Montcalm were both killed. The Battle of the Plains of Abraham might have just been another battle of the 7 Years' War, which pitted Britain, Portugal, and Prussia against the French, Austrians, Spanish, and Russians. In 1763, when the Treaty of Paris was negotiated, France ceded all of its territory on the North American mainland to Britain and Spain. This included the colony of Canada, which under the British became known as the Province of Quebec. Although the British had gained a vast amount of land that essentially guaranteed them as a dominant power in North America, most of the new province was French-speaking and Catholic, something that worried the Protestant British. To prevent unrest, which at the time was already brewing in the 13 colonies to the south, the Quebec Act of 1774 was passed, which among other things removed references to Protestantism from the Oath of Loyalty to George III, granted the Catholic Church right to collect tithes from the area, and allowed French laws and customs to be used alongside English ones. While the act placated the Quebecois, it was listed as an intolerable act by the 13 colonies, which would declare independence just 2 years later and in the end have a profound effect on Quebecois society. The American War of Independence led to the mass migration of loyalists from the new United States of America into the remaining British holdings. Although not as many loyalists moved to Quebec as to the other colonies such as New Brunswick and Florida, enough did so that the province now consisted of a significant Protestant population. In response, the British enacted the Constitutional Act of 1791, which divided Quebec into Upper and Lower Canada. Upper Canada was administered under British law, whereas Lower Canada retained French institutions. The reasons for this division were twofold. One, the Crown hoped to reduce ethnic tension by placating both the French, who were angry that the British were seemingly being treated more favorably, and the English, who believed that the French had far too much influence. Secondly, the American Independence War had shocked and dismayed the British, who believed that too much democracy and not too little had been the cause of the revolution. Therefore, they worked to prevent any new democratic institution from gaining actual power. By splitting the previously huge province, it was hoped that the colony would become easier to administer. The act for the first time gave the Quebecois their own primarily French cultural land and allowed the English to settle elsewhere. However, it also proved problematic in that it attempted to introduce a legislative council that was to be directly ruled by representatives of London, which could effectively overrule the elected legislative assembly. In time, this unfair system came to be dominated by wealthy English merchants. In Lower Canada, it was the Chateau clique, and in Upper Canada, the family compact. By the 1830s, tensions were at an all-time high as elected leaders in both Canadas were actively campaigning for reform of the government, which naturally fell on deaf ears. In Quebec, these calls were led by Louis-Joseph Papineau, who was the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly. In 1834, he and his Parti Canadien drafted the 92 resolutions, which, among other things, demanded for a responsible government and democratic processes. Naturally, the British ignored the resolutions. The call for reforms in Lower Canada then became a struggle between the French-speaking lower classes and the British rulers. Ever since the start of British rule, the Quebecois were only loyal to the colonial system as long as it was better than the American Republican system. Although London understood this, their fear of another revolution when the 1791 Constitutional Act was drafted had caused them to instead implement reactionary and austere systems in an effort to prevent it. Ironically, this had the opposite effect. By 1837, Papineau had had enough. He had fought for years for change through action in the Legislative Assembly, but had been stonewalled by the Chateau clique. Thanks to a series of economic troubles and civil unrest, the Parti Canadien, now known as the Parti Patriote, had become a major force of Quebecois nationalism, and many of its members were actively urging for an uprising. The first clashes took place in November against English-speaking paramilitaries, but the rebels were quickly defeated after British troops arrived. Then, rebels led by William Lyon Mackenzie in Upper Canada followed suit in December that year, but that rebellion was also crushed. Papineau tried again the following year, but this uprising went even worse than the first one, and he fled to the United States to avoid arrest. However, the rebellions of 1837 had the desired effect. London in 1840 passed the Act of Union, which combined the two Canadas and introduced, at least on paper, a responsible government. Lord Durham, who was appointed to recommend reforms, hoped that the rapidly growing English population would be able to assimilate French speakers and eliminate the problem altogether. Therefore, French was banned from government use and various French institutions were suspended. The new Legislative Assembly was divided equally into 42 seats each for both Canada West and Canada East, as the former Upper and Lower Canadas were now called. However, despite giving the appearance of a new democratic system, the Act of Union had in fact farther marginalized the Quebecois. Although Canada East had a larger population than Canada West, both were granted an equal number of seats. Canada East had less debt, but both of Canada's debts had been combined, placing more burdens on Quebec. Nevertheless, both the French and English-speaking populations agreed to work together and rapidly undid many of the Act's unfair clauses. In 1848, under the joint leadership of Louis Lafontaine and Robert Baldwin, a truly responsible Canadian government was formed, nearly a century after the Battle on the Plains of Abraham. But this was not the end of Anglo-French tensions. Instead, it was only the beginning. In 1849, just 1 year after the introduction of responsible government, an angry English mob would storm and burn down the Parliament building in Montreal.